Welcome to the Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. According to the World Health Organization, intimate partner violence, or IPV, has been shown to cause serious physical and mental health problems. Overwhelmingly, women represent the majority of cases, and US-based Human Rights Campaign says that queer women are more likely than their straight counterparts to experience IPV. It's a global issue. Helping to address this problem within the LGBTQIA+ community in Australia is Belinda Bannerman. With more than 15 years of experience, Belinda is a trauma recovery trainer and practitioner. Here to discuss the realities of domestic violence and to talk about their efforts to help queer people recover is Belinda Bannerman. Hi, Belinda.
Hi, Fabio. It's great to be with you. Thank you.
What is intimate partner violence?
So in Australia, this term is used and it can be fairly recognised across the world. It may be referred to at different times as domestic violence, or sometimes people speak about partner abuse, and it can also be termed as family violence. So intimate partner violence is the term I'll use, and it's particularly about the intimate relationships people have. So it might, in the context, about violence and abuse that occurs in that context. So often it's seen between couples, which is different from where it might be a caregiver or a parent towards a child, or a sibling towards a sibling. That might be termed as family violence. So intimate partner violence covers and talks about a dynamic where there's a power indifference, and at the core of that dynamic is one person is seeking to use particular tactics to gain control and power over their partner. And there's usually a lot of fear involved, and those tactics, or the way that person develops and creates that control, is often seen in different forms of what we might call intimate partner violence, which people are usually more readily aware of, which might include emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial, sexual, and physical. And there's a range of risk factors that might be involved as well. So that's a brief kind of summary. I guess one of the really important things to understand about it is that it is a dynamic that involves a pattern of behaviours and is not about a one-off occurrence. That's something that people can often misunderstand, is that they look for only signs of physical violence or abuse, and they see them as an isolated experience. But what we know from so much research is that it is about an ongoing pattern of behaviour that usually escalates in severity and frequency.
I was looking up stats online, and I noticed that a lot of the stats are pre-COVID, so it's a little bit dated, but I was looking at the Government of Canada website, and what they were saying is that in Canada, overall, 67% of LGB plus women who have ever been in an intimate partner relationship had experienced at least one type of IPV since the age of 15, compared to 44% among heterosexual women. And I looked at other stats as well, and it seemed to be consistent across the board in terms of, by and large, the women within the queer community face this more than straight women. Why do you think that is?
So one of the things about talking about women in the queer community, it's important to think about the concepts around gender and sexuality. And so whether those statistics are also are they talking about cis women, or are they talking about trans women as well? And are they, because we know the stats are very high for trans women, and we know that usually the stats that I'm aware of, the ones that I've seen in Australia and more broadly, speak about cis women who may identify as queer or bisexual. And often the stats reveal, if they ask those questions, that the person who has inflicted that harm, or some people use the term perpetrator or person using violence, is a cis man. Not always, but there's often an experience that that person who, particularly for bisexual women, cis women, that they have experienced the harm or the violence from a cis male partner at some point. When we're looking at statistics around cases or situations of people in the LGBTQIA plus community reporting intimate partner violence, there's still kind of an emergence of how the stats are understood and how people identify. So this is one of the things that's kind of we're still coming to understand. And one of the things about that is that, first of all, does the person identify what's happened to them as intimate partner violence? So whether they're able to self-identify. And because there can be different ways that people I'm going to use the term queer as an umbrella term, and I recognise that for some people in the community, queer can be a really charged term. So I just want to acknowledge it, particularly for older people of the LGBTQI community, that queer was used in a weaponised way. But I know that for some other people, they've reclaimed that. But I'm going to just use that as a bit of an umbrella term with that acknowledgement. When people are looking to understand those statistics and interpret what are the patterns here, what does it mean for people, and what are the potential risk factors, what's similar and what might be different for this cohort, is that the way that some people in the queer community experience what intimate partner violence looks like, there's some unique aspects that are not experienced by, say, cis women in heterosexual relationships. So I just want to clarify, when I'm talking about cis and trans, or trans and gender diverse people, I'm talking about gender identity. So cis talks about, being aligned with what you were assigned at birth, and trans talks about being not aligned with what you were assigned at birth. We do know that the statistics for trans and gender diverse people, including trans femme and trans women, are very high, much higher and overrepresented for that level of the population. We also know, in particular, around sexual violence, that this is also really high statistics as well for this population group. I work across sexual assault and intimate partner violence, and specialise in that area in the queer community. And it's still something that's unfolding and evolving around our understanding of the prevalence and some of the unique aspects.
Thank you for saying those things. I mean, the first thing I want to thank you for is for explaining or elaborating on why we might be using the word queer. I think that's really important. So thank you for saying that. And I also appreciate what you were saying about the stats and how there are proportionately more people who are bisexual or trans or gender diverse that are experiencing these situations of intimate partner violence. And so thank you for saying that. And I did notice that in the stats as well. And it was interesting because it showed that cisgender lesbian women were, I guess if we were looking at the stats and we're talking about reported cases, right? So they were at the bottom, and then the second level was bisexual women, and then the level above that was transgender women, at least from what I saw on the internet anyway. And it's a good point that you mentioned too about reported cases, right? Because I was also seeing about, what are the challenges behind why people might not report a case. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit about that and the particular challenges from each of those groups within the LGBTQIA plus community.
Yeah, so many challenges. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot of barriers around seeking support that people can face, and they're very diverse based on perhaps their experiences of intersectionality and the different elements that are unique to their social identity and perhaps their experiences of compounding oppression. So, what I mean by that is one way to think about it is to think about what are the particular things that the person using violence is using to keep that person in a space of fear and control. And so that's at that individual, interpersonal level. But what are the systems that sit in society that also, through processes of discrimination, power imbalances, and homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia, that also then contribute to the challenges and the barriers that that person experiencing violence might be facing. So there's this, it's important to think about this in terms of an individual level, but also a broader systems and society level, because you can't separate them. And when we think about that, so for example, one of the ways that a person using violence and the tactics of power and control might maintain control over their partner or the intimate partner is, say, for example, if the person who's experiencing violence is a trans woman, they might be using tactics around their gender and affirming their gender, like, for example, putting pressure on them to actually change aspects of themselves or their body to undergo surgeries or not, access to hormones or, access to resources to see doctors, whether they could see the doctor by themselves or not, aspects around what kinds of ways that their body is being seen or spoken about or touched or not. They could also be using insults to talk about their gender in a way that's non-affirming and really belittling. So there's those aspects are very unique to, and those tactics are unique to a person experiencing violence from the LGBTQI community. So how elements around their social identity are used by the perpetrator to maintain that fear and control. One of the aspects around that fear and control is that actually, if we think about under that, there's like an annihilation of a self, a sense of autonomy, a sense of self, a sense of worth, a sense of capacity in the world, a sense of ability and safety to make your own decisions, to move through the world and be safe. And so this kind of grounding down and this sort of pulling at the threads of who somebody is an ongoing experience. And so that's one of the things that people often don't understand is the impact of that kind of behaviour towards somebody can be extremely long lasting, even after that person may have left that situation, and goes to the core of their capacity to be in the world and feel good about themselves. And when we combine that with somebody who's experiencing transphobia, being able to access an intimate partner violence service, and they access a refuge, I know in Canada they've been way ahead of Australia in terms of being able to have services that are open to trans women to come into refuge. But in Australia, we're still really just dragging our feet. That's been a very long process, and there's been a lot of discussion and debate about that. There now are some refuges in Victoria and Melbourne and other parts of Australia that are opening their doors to trans and gender diverse people, but not all of them. And I would also say, and this is something that a lot of advocates in the queer community talk about, is what is the cultural safety for a trans or gender diverse person or queer person to come into that refuge as well. So while they may say, yes, you can come, do they have the cultural safety to enable that person to come there and not experience trans or bi or homophobia? I wanted to circle back to a question you said around why might there be high instances. And I think one of the things that's important to think about and know is what drives violence and gendered violence. Like, what are the drivers? What we know from overwhelmingly from research is that there's drivers around gender inequality and gender roles. And in particular, the concept of gender often sits in a binary concept, which is male and female, man and woman. And when we think about patriarchy and the impacts of a giant systematic system that preferences one gender to hold power over another gender. And I'm talking very broadly, and there's institutions and laws and lots of changes that have happened, but this still continues in many, many places and in many ways, and often in more subtle ways than we think. One of the things that I wanted to perhaps let people know about is there's been more kind of research done around what might that be for LGBTQIA people who've experienced, what might be driving some of the intimate partner violence there. And there's lots of different, there's different thoughts around this, but research that's been really, I think, illuminating in Australia is from Rainbow Health Australia. And a couple of years ago, they did a kind of a broad lit search, a literature review around the world, and they've published a report called Pride in Prevention, if anyone wants to look at that, and looks at how this same idea around gender roles and gender norms and holding, one gender holding power over another continues to contribute to the ways that people experience violence in queer community and in queer relationships as well. And then there's the role of colonisation on top of that, and thinking about how has that impacted and continues to impact the harm. So I think that's really important to sort of have a broader understanding of what some of the drivers are and what the institutions and the social norms that continue to reinforce some of those messages around gender and roles and power from a broader systemic and institutional level right down to the interpersonal.
Those are really important points. I'm glad that you mentioned the whole thing about power and the power dynamic, because I would imagine that there are people in relationships, regardless of whether they're queer or not, that may not know that they are in a situation that represents intimate partner violence. And so just being able to understand the signs, I think, is really important as well. Some of the things that I was hearing around the cases in particular with the queer community is things that you've highlighted around socioeconomic control over what people are wearing. There's also control in situations where people are not out, and sort of the control of, well, you can't leave me because if you do, I'm going to tell XYZ person. And so there's many different layers to that, as well as race. So you said intersectionality. There's that whole dynamic as well, too. So I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit about the signs that people might look out for in their own relationship dynamic, the one that they might be in right now, or to watch out for in a future dynamic that they might have.
Yeah, that's really important. I think one of the things that is perhaps useful to do is to reflect on when we're working with people, some of the things that we would do is sort of ask them questions like this. Has there ever been a time in your relationship where you've been fearful of that person or felt anxious or concerned about what might happen? So we kind of sometimes we get people to reflect on that, and they might say no. Go, okay. Has there ever been a time when you feel like that person's controlled you? And so then we unpack what that might look like. So some of the things you've mentioned, like having expectations or telling someone where they can go, who they can see, who they can be friends with, who they can't be friends with, monitoring and wanting to know who are you talking to on the phone, who are you texting, can I check your phone, can I use an app on the phone to track where you are, can I borrow money off you, or I can only give you this much money, or it's your turn to pay for this, or whatever it is. So some of that stuff around power in terms of financial aspects, ideas and expectations around the time, like where have you been, where are you going, when are you going to get home. Also, some of the other things that people talk about there's a term that's been used a lot, and I think most people have probably heard it. It's been used quite a lot, is gaslighting. Gaslighting is a term that refers to a psychological tactic, and that's the idea really where a person using violence is using things that kind of make the other person question their own reality or question their own concept of what's real, or you said this, no, I didn't, yes, you did, or what's happening. And it comes from a film way back in the, I think it's around the 1930s or 40s, called Gaslighting, where the person in the film was actually playing with the gas lights and turning them on and off and making this person in the film feel like it was crazy making. So the idea is that it's something that happens that questions that person's competence psychologically, questions their reality, makes them think that they're not sure what's going on and that they sound like they're crazy. I mean, I don't like using that term, but it's that idea of questioning reality and going, are you in control? Do you understand what's going on? Have you got a sense of capacity and competence? So people use this term a lot now in ways that are much broader than intimate partner violence context. And there are times when that happens, but I also think we're at risk of kind of diminishing the actual impact and the particular kind of dynamic where this particular strategy and tactic is used. And it's important to recognise that there is a difference when people are in a situation where there's fear and threats and risk, and that's sitting in a context of ongoing abuse, versus a time where someone might have a conversation with somebody else outside of that and think that person was kind of making me question, or they were questioning my reality or my truth. So it's important that we don't diminish the impact of that, and we don't see them as sitting in the same basket or having the same drivers or dynamics overall. I think one of the other things is to think about, and this is really important in terms of, and is often not talked about in more mainstream family violence and intimate partner violence and sexual assault services, is thinking about, queer communities are, have different experiences of relationships, and what does relationship look like? So when we think about intimate partner violence, people are thinking about one person with another person, but we know that there's, and this is not just for the queer community, but we know that there's a large polyamorous community, people in the queer community who may have more than one partner. And how does that look in those sorts of situations? What might be the dynamic sitting there? And people who might be involved in the kink community, and thinking about how does control sit in terms of sexual behaviour and identity and relating. And that sometimes there can be a whole lot of judgment. When we were talking before about what might be some of the barriers to people reporting, well, one of the big barriers might be the concept around judgment. So around if a person has a primary partner and they've been out seeing another person and there's been some kind of assault, or there's been some other dynamic that's happening in terms of fear and threat, that, the idea of going to a service, a mainstream service, to say this is what's happening and having to explain, well, I'm in a polyamorous relationship, this is how this works, but this is, just kind of the constant need to explain self and life is exhausting. And it comes up against these judgments around, that are often sitting in an axis of a heterosexual, cis-normative kind of paradigm. So just having to kind of get through those things to then get to a point of going, is it safe for me to do that and be myself and to talk about my life, and then receive a service that's non-judgmental? That is a huge challenge. So I think it's important, though, for people to think about, okay, if you are in an open relationship, or you're in open relating, or you're negotiating different ways of relating, do you feel free to do that and have your sense of autonomy? Is there anything around sexual relating where you feel like you're being coerced or pressured to be involved in or do any kind of behaviour that you don't fully consent to? And when we talk about consent, we talk about being willing is one aspect, being open to wanting to do something, and then also speaking about, are you just tolerating something or enduring something? Because those two things are not full-bodied in consent. So when people are asking themselves about a relating dynamic or a relationship and thinking, is this a healthy, respectful relationship where power is shared between us and we're really clear about how it works and safe, that we're thinking about, do you have free will to make choices without the fear that you're going to be punished psychologically or emotionally or physically in some way? that concept of punish is misplaced here. It's more a feeling. Do you have a concern or a fear that something's going to happen if you make your own free will and you make your own free choices? Or are you making choices around modifying and managing somebody else's responses and behaviour so that you can feel safe and okay? Because if you're constantly making choices about what you do in your life around managing someone else's behaviour, then I think it's important to start thinking about that and asking yourself some questions, having a conversation with a trusted friend, and just being open to looking at what is the dynamic there. Do you feel able to make choices that are good for you, that you feel safe to do, and that's respected, and you have full ownership of that? Often people jump to the concept of physical abuse, and I've talked very much around some of the nuances around really unpacking and thinking about how do you feel and what is your capacity to make choices and be free to do that. Obviously, if there's some very clear aspects around being controlled and that you've got fear and that you're being monitored and that you're being threatened and that you've actually experienced physical aspects, that they're very clear signs that that is intimate partner violence and that's happening. People often excuse that or think there's broader concepts like, it only happens if someone's stressed, it only happens if someone's taken some substance, it only happens because they've experienced a lot of trauma, it's only happened when we fight. There's all of these kind of concepts. Or they're just a jealous person, that's who they are. Like, all of those things may be true, but they are not excuses for someone's behaviour, and it needs to be separated out, that people are still responsible for their behaviour.
There's also an isolation element to this too, right? Because I would imagine that in some cases, there could be people within the queer community that might not have a wide network to tap into, to talk to people and say, hey, look, this is what's happening in my relationship. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Such a good point. Oh, yeah, I think there's two other things that I think sit alongside isolation, and that's shame and stigma. And those things can often all combine to further impact someone's sense of isolation. So isolation can definitely come when a person using violence starts to control who someone might see, or says, I don't like that person, or you shouldn't be with, or physically moves to another place with them. So it might be geographical isolation, social isolation, less time with the family. This person a lot of queer people don't necessarily automatically have good relationships, or may have experienced trans or bi or homophobia from their family, so they may be not in a space where they're supported already. And that isolation can compound a sense of self and a sense of how big their world is. Someone's world is controlled and shrunk down to basically the person using violence is their main person in their world and is kind of at the centre of the climate of their world and the people they interact with or don't. It makes seeing other opportunities and accessing other opportunities for support really, really difficult. So especially if there's been lateral violence across the queer community where the person using violence might have, spread misinformation about somebody so that they've isolated them through their networks, there could have been like a very deliberate sort of, use of that as well, so that they've already been set up as a liar or set up as someone who can't be trusted, or, they might have been set up as the person who's perpetrating the violence. So there's unique aspects there. Seeking support, like I said before, being able to feel like, there's a real stigma. And I think this is another thing that happens or can happen for queer people. When I do training to services around responding to queer survivors, one of the things I talk about is the idea that any survivor, particularly in terms of sexual trauma and intimate partner violence, will often, can often be feeling shame, and that's misplaced, victim blaming. But what happens there is, they have to walk through a door to get to the service, right? And I talk about the idea of queer people have to often walk through two doors to get to the service. maybe a few more doors. But one of them is there's 2 levels of shame, particularly when there's been a society shames queer people for their gender and their sexual variation. And that is done on so many levels and has been done to various and continues to happen in legislation and across places. Still, that they have to take that risk to reach safety. And then it's their own experience of whatever shame and shaming tactics that a person using violence might have put on them. And we have a response as humans to shame that makes us kind of recoil, makes us feel smaller. It makes us kind of shut down. It's kind of that kind of shut down and die sort of space. It's a very neurological, it's a very kind of felt experience. People know instantly that very, very powerful feeling of shame. It makes it much harder to push out and reach out for support. So there's that double barrel of shame and stigma, that internal feeling, but the external response from different places in society about the stigma. So those 2 doors that people have to walk through. So I often talk to services about it's your job to open those doors. It's not the person experiencing the abuse. There needs to be systemic change around how do we open those doors, because the service is the one who has capacity and they have more power. So they need to use that in a very intentional way to be conscious of how can we make it safe for everybody to access this service.
I was reading about barriers, and some of them that I read were low awareness and availability of affirming services, difficulty accessing LGBTQ plus specific or inclusive affirming agencies and services. And then the list goes on. It talks about this being a specific issue, or a heightened issue, I should say, for transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming survivors. You were mentioning how in Canada there's some effort to improve that. Have you seen a shift towards making things more inclusive, receptive, welcoming, safe for the queer community?
So I'm very passionate about this. And last year, 2023, just prior to that, I was, I think, feeling a bit frustrated about Australia's progress and feeling like this is going way too slow. And I looked further afield and found so many examples of such great work and progression in Canada and the United States. And so I decided that I would do a very big project, a personal project, and I went and self-funded and went on a 2.5-month odyssey over to Canada and the States to go and interview agencies. And my kind of research sort of question, or my exploratory question, was looking at best practice responses to sexual assault and intimate partner violence for queer people, so queer survivors. And I went and looked at queer-specific agencies, but also mainstream agencies, intimate partner violence agencies, sexual assault agencies. So I went to Toronto, New York, Boston, Vancouver, Seattle, and San Francisco, and went and talked to many agencies around what were the programs they had, what was the approaches they took, where were they going in terms of how they worked with the community, how they created pathways both to queer-specific services and to mainstream services. There was so much that has happened in those 2 parts of the world, and it's probably no surprise that Toronto's leading the way. It's done amazing work, particularly in terms of the research and the response to trans survivors of sexual assault, which is part of why I went over there. I was really excited about that. And part of what I wanted to do was to kind of think about what are some of the programs and what are some of the frameworks and approaches, and what has been some of the pathways that so many advocates have fought so hard for to make the inroads, and what can we learn and what can we bring back here. So I was really inspired by the work that had been going on for 15, 20 years or much longer, but I could see that those areas, those places were a good 10, 15 years ahead of us. In terms of what's happening here, I think in Australia I can speak more with an understanding around the state of Victoria where I live and Melbourne, and that is that there's been a lot more talk and focus on including and expanding an understanding of needing to increase the capacity of services to respond, both specialist queer services and mainstream services. Also, at the same time, that there's been data to show that we have a high representation in those two areas. So, of course, those things kind of sit side by side. Another big thing that's been a huge catalyst, particularly in Victoria, is that in 2016, we had a Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria, and that was a very, it was kind of Australia leading experience. That then there was 222 or 26 recommendations that came down around needing a statewide response to responding to family violence. And so many things were considered, but some of those were specific recommendations about changing practice and increasing service access for LGBTQI community. So there's beginnings there, I guess, from a government perspective around going, we need to focus on this, we need to do some work. What that means in terms of what does it mean now for a survivor who picks up a phone or wants to go to a door, or is it's still not consistent. There's still huge variation. While agencies are required now, family violence agencies are required as part of their funding to do what's called a rainbow tick. And a rainbow tick is an accreditation process that the agency is required to go through and look at how are they being inclusive and how do they work through all of their policies, through the whole agency around working with the queer community. We're sort of saying that it's not just about a tick, it's about an ongoing practice. And so it really depends then on who's in that agency, who continues to embed that practice. And as new people come into the service, what is the culture that's been created at that service, where there's an understanding and awareness of how do we work and what do we need to do that's different to enable those service doors to open, like I said before, so that the workers in there opening those doors and removing some of those barriers. There's always examples of people doing amazing work and going, yep, and that's often sat down with, individuals and how people build those kind of informal and formal networks of support and referrals. So I know that's happening. And then there's always the process of change where there's always the parts of the system that are lagging. And I think that's what you see in any kind of change, as you see some parts moving ahead and making amazing experiences, and then some parts are going, really, it's time to catch up. So we are definitely needing to pick up the pace on that. And I guess that's one of my areas of passion. And there's some people doing some great work, but, it needs to be done yesterday. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I saw a stat, and I know that I could just talk about the stats this entire interview because there's just so much out there. But I did see something that shocked me only because I didn't expect to see it. This is according to the Royal Commission in Australia, and this was a report that was commissioned by the Disability Royal Commission. And it was about what LGBTQIA plus people with disabilities experience. For whatever reason, it just didn't occur to me that this would happen. But sadly, it makes sense that they would experience higher rates of violence. And so I'm wondering, in your work that you do, what can you share about that layer, that complexity to this issue?
So we do know that the rates of violence for intimate partner violence for people with disability are much higher in terms of the risk. And we know that for cis women, but we also know that for trans and gender diverse and queer people. One of the aspects around people who have a disability, with a disability, is that if their partner is working in any way or providing care to them, it sets up a dynamic where there's a level of dependence, right? So that care is being provided towards the other. The withholding of that care or the abuse that can happen in that context, it's a way that's very unique to that experience that can be targeted to have a big impact around power and control for that victim survivor. It makes also just the practical logistics, depending on what the nature of that disability is, for somebody to access an environment with the care and the facilities they may need to work and to live independently without whatever may have been set up with their partner. For example, if somebody needs particular facilities to work, they need particular machinery, or they need particular mobility aids, or they need to live on a ground level, or they need to be closer to a specialist or to a pain clinic, or they need to be able to access public transport in a particular way to get to the services that assist them to function, then those things around where they live, what transport they can access, how much it costs, what their work capacity to work and to access education, their support, if they're reliant on somebody to drive them and that person is their partner and they can't, for whatever reason, even if it's a temporary aspect, perhaps they have a long-term injury, they're not able to drive a car at this point. So those things create levels where it's very easy for somebody to take advantage of that dependence or that requirement for support and use that as a tactic. Then for them to be able to go into a refuge or go and live independently in another space, it's much harder to access those resources very quickly and set up a space where they're able to have access transport, access care, access any medical support they might need. If there are children or dependents or pets involved, people often forget about the importance of pets as well. And that's been recognised so much in that Royal Commission and also as one of the risk factors if there's any threats to pets. And so it's great now. I also work in a family violence refuge to be in purpose-built refuges where people can bring their pets, because that's often a thing where people might not leave a situation because they're not able to take their pet with them. So say somebody has a therapy dog or they have a service dog, they'll be able to take that with them, but can they access the vet? Can they take them to get the care that they need? Do they have the financial resourcing to do that? Or do they have the capacity to access the services? Can they use technology unassisted? There's all sorts of ways those things can happen. But it's also the psychological aspects of having a carer who might have taken on or diminished that person's capacity to be independent too, because that's part of a power and control dynamic, is to keep that dependence happening. But I know of situations where a cis gay man who was on a motorised scooter, whose partner was their carer, needed to and was experiencing very high levels of violence and was at risk and would have been put into a refuge. There was a lot of advocacy done by a specialist family violence queer service for him to gain access to the same kind of support and facility that a cis woman might have experienced. So there's those extra barriers around not a lot of places for people who require particular kinds of physical environments. They're building them now, which has been a big push, but we know those things are built slowly. But it's also the social and psychological and medical or whatever the other supports might be, and the capacity to feel like they're able to, because it's that psychological impact as well, that kind of grinding down someone's sense of self.
You're talking about accessibility barriers for people that have disabilities that are experiencing intimate partner violence. I just want to get one terminology piece clear. So when you use the word refuge, is that akin to safe house?
Yeah, so in Australia, that's a family violence or domestic violence refuge. So that means that it's high security. That means it's an undisclosed location. It's for people escaping family violence or domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And it's a place where there's support workers and social workers who work there specifically for that area. And there's a whole process of applying, going there, and a criteria to go there. So, yeah, I think it's the same as a safe house in other parts of the world.
Thank you. I'm glad that you also mentioned the case involving the cisgender gay man, because although the stats weigh more in the area of either cisgender women, whether straight or queer, and also for transgender people as well as gender nonconforming people, I think it's important for us to raise that this is also an issue amongst the gay community, the gay male community. So thank you for sharing that as well. I want to talk about you. So you've been in this business of helping people heal from trauma, sexual trauma, trauma related to intimate partner violence, trauma related to family violence. You've been doing this for 15 years and you have your own business. I just wanted you to share a little bit about your journey to doing what you're doing and also explain a little bit about the services that you offer.
I've been working in the area of, some people talk about it as gendered violence for 15 years. And that's been working in family violence refuges, like I just said. So going on site and being there with people who have come in, primarily that's cis women and their children, and offering that crisis response and that first sort of trauma response. I've also been doing work where I'm on call and I go out to the police station or the hospital or the hotel to see people straight after they may have left a violent situation, a dangerous situation. I'm right through to doing work where I also work on a telephone, a sexual assault crisis line after hours, where I speak to victim survivors who may have had recent assaults or that could be from years ago. And that is all working with coordinating care, but primarily it's also working from a very strong understanding around trauma in the body. And I guess in the last 10 years in particular, I've been on a sort of a personal and professional learning experience of understanding different modalities of responding and healing trauma, and then looking at how to integrate those into the work that I do now and the different ways that I support people as I continue to learn. So I guess some of those modalities I use are the TRTP, which is the Richards Trauma Process, which is unique to a woman called Judith Richards, who started that in Australia and uses different types of aspects of therapies and frameworks that sit out there to really, I guess, transform an experience of trauma in the body. I also use EFT, or emotional freedom technique, or tapping. Some people might have heard of that. Became far more awareness of that in the last sort of 10 years. And I use havening, which is a havening technique, which is also using the body and the connection between the body and the brain to transform the neurological and emotional impacts of trauma. I work from a broader framework of a trauma and violence informed framework, which just came out of Canada, and a strengths-based approach, along with a very strong queer intersectional feminist approach. So I know those terms are quite big and there's lots to unpack there, but I guess how I would sort of put it and explain it is that my journey and learning has been doing courses and then working with people, but also my own personal experience of transforming experiences of trauma and challenge in my life. And really, now I kind of view things quite differently. So my framework, I would sort of summarize as using all of those things. But I've already said a few times the idea of transforming trauma. And I actually think more now about the way that we think around alchemizing trauma and our experiences of alchemy. And that's like, to me, it's the concept of how do we take something that's been really difficult or distressing and impacts us as a whole person. And so we know now there's so many strong connections between our body and our brain and our sense of self and our soul and all of those things, our holistic self. How do we take some of these amazing understandings and perspectives that people have developed and discovered over many, many years and hundreds of years, some of them? And then what does that mean in terms of how can we change that experience in our own bodies and ourselves as it has changed us, but how can we move that into a space of strength and liberation? One of the things that I've found is that some of the trauma therapies or some of the types of therapies that people talk about now, I found them to be useful in particular issues in life, but not very effective in terms of working with people who are experiencing ongoing trauma symptoms. So I would say that I've engaged in lots of talk therapy, and that's that kind of thing. You go in and see someone, you talk through feelings, and that's really useful. And there's lots of different frameworks that people use to do that. But there's a big emergence now in somatics, so soma, the body and the skin, and thinking about we live this in our bodies, and we think about what happens in our cells, what happens in our brains, and that it's so, so interconnected. And what I've discovered and why I use those three modalities is because they're very, very quickly and very, very deeply with the least amount of distress. In fact, I'd say minimal to no distress, because we don't need to relive and retell everything to transform and heal. There's definitely a place where you can tell your story and have your voice heard, and that's absolutely important. But you don't have to go back through everything and relive as such in order to heal. So I use these ones because they're also something that somebody can use independent of me. So if they come and have some sessions, I really want to walk alongside someone, hold the space, go, you've got this. Here's some stuff that I've learned and I know about. What's the stuff you already know? Let's build on that. And then, okay, fantastic. Now you've got these other aspects of knowing who you are on a deeper level. You've really connected to your own power. You've reconnected back to your gut instinct and your intuition. Because one of the big things that happens when we experience trauma, particularly any sexual trauma, is there's a mechanism where we feel disconnected from our own intuition and self, and we doubt ourselves. We're not actually disconnected, but we feel it. So really, the work that I do is around reconnecting people back to their power and their really strong, grounded sense of themselves. And so as life continues, because there's always going to be challenges in life, we've got this new capacity and knowingness in ourselves that we are able to alchemize what happens in our life and to continue to expand and experience more love and experience more joy and experience more light. So I find a lot of trauma therapies at the moment just focused on how do we manage symptoms. And that's just not enough for me. It's just so not enough. I think we have so many more things in our capacity, in our connection to one another. And I guess one of the really big things I bring on is how do we use nature? How do we use the environment and the natural environment around us to work with our nervous systems to do huge amounts of healing? Like if we bring our consciousness into that, we've got this amazing gift right there, and we're only really starting to wake up on a larger scale about how we use that as healing. I know there's been so many thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge and wisdom and healing that we have, in our colonist sort of arrogance, neglected and not seen. And we really need to be sitting in that place of listening and learning and deep humility to kind of go, okay, all right, it's time we start kind of opening ourselves to what is really here and who can we really experience ourselves to be.
I'm really happy that you brought up the somatic work that you do and connecting with the body and how trauma gets stored in the body. I was reading a book recently, I haven't finished it, but it's by Gabor Mate. And he writes about how when trauma is stored in the body and if it's not released, it can lead to ailments. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I think, anyone who's sort of looked at trauma and done any of that kind of work will know about the ACEs study. So that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study done back in the 90s in the States. And it was actually a health study. So they were looking, I think it was about 26,000 participants. So a very large study. It was a longitudinal health study. And the idea was they were looking at chronic illness and disease and going, what are some of the key contributors to chronic illness and disease? And what they discovered unexpectedly was that those people who had what we would call trauma in childhood, the more instances of trauma, so for example, if someone experienced family violence and they'd also experienced sexual harm or physical harm, the more of those they had in their childhood, it correlated with the more likelihood and the worse health impacts they had later in life. And one of the things around this study was it really highlighted the connection between some of the long-term health impacts of trauma that people can experience. So obviously there are other aspects as well, but it was really putting on the map, I guess, the fact that childhood trauma can have a lifelong impact on somebody, and particularly this was around the body. So we know that just thinking around in terms of the chemicals that happens in the brain and the body is that when you experience that, a stress response and a very high level of stress or distress, you have a spike in your adrenaline, you have a spike in your stress hormone cortisol. And what happens is that the body is built so that when we experience, the danger is over, we are meant to return to a neurological place of safety. So our adrenaline comes down and our cortisol comes down. Now, cortisol takes twice as long to come down. It stays in the system way longer, and it can have adverse impacts on your system if it's there for a sustained and long period of time. When we're living in situations where there's high stress, that cortisol level never really gets to come right down. And the ongoing impacts of really long periods of very high cortisol in the body are now have been studied for many years and been showing this is part of why there's these ongoing impacts on pain management in the body, on contributions to memory, contributions to independence and movement, contributions to all kinds of things. So what I think about is we have this incredible capacity in our bodies to heal. Our systems are orientated and built to heal. And what we need to do is focus on what are the things that we need to provide our body and our system. What is the environment? What are the factors that are going to allow it to build and come back to an equilibrium, to allow it to tap into its natural capacity to manage and to change and to shift? So you mentioned Gabor Mate, but there's also someone, I think, Peter Levine, who's done a lot of work around, he's Waking the Tiger, I would suggest for people to read. He sort of started somatic experiencing, which is really looking at all mammals have this capacity to shake. So what happens is once there's been there's that adrenaline, they've had the cortisol, they've had the fear, the fight, flight, freeze response, and then the danger has passed, and then to shift and discharge that charge of stress and high energy and that readiness to respond and out of the body, they shake. So they notice this in polar bears. But if you look at your dog or anyone's dog and you just notice that every now and then they just do this random shaking, they're literally shaking something off. They're discharging something from their system. And so we're the only mammal that's kind of stopped that loop of discharge. And so we hold it in our bodies rather than kind of shaking it off. I mean, it's interesting to me that we have these comments around just shake it off, because we actually inherently, innately know in our system there's something about that that's really helpful. And there are whole modalities, trauma release exercises that are used and look at shaking. So it's kind of going, okay, there's actually physical things we can do that support the body to come back to the center and to balance. There's lots of different ways people can access and work with somatic, body-based healing. There's yoga. Some people use acupuncture. There's havening. There's, meditation. There's breathing. There's breath work. There's trauma release exercises. There's a whole bunch I'm sure I don't even know about. But really, part of the big premise is that idea of we are embodying. So we come back to our body and come back to being in our body. And what happens often when we experience trauma is we leave our body or we disconnect from our sense of ourself. And for good, that's part of a safety and part of a very creative way of managing and surviving. And so when we're looking at kind of integrating and processing trauma, part of that is to come back and reconnect to this amazing thing we've been given called this body. And I really understand, particularly having worked in sexual trauma, for a lot of people that doesn't feel like a safe place. But there are very, very effective ways to come back and reclaim and embody your space of your physical being as being a safe place.
You mentioned earlier about connecting to consciousness and connecting to nature. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot more studies now done. Something called, in Japan, we're talking about forest bathing and people talking about what's the impacts of our nervous system, taking a stressed or heightened or distressed nervous system into a natural environment when we're working through the senses. So one of the things around somatics and trauma in the body is understand that trauma is laid down through the body and it's experienced through the senses. So what we hear, what do we see, what do we smell, what do we taste, and what do we touch? I guess one of the things about people sort of understanding now and doing research around the impact of being in nature on our nervous systems and our sense of wellness and our mental health is that this is like taking ancient knowledge and kind of, science is now saying this actually works. And so there's been so many practices in so many communities and cultures since the beginning of time that has used nature and understood that we have an inherent connection to our environment that is really good for us. So places, I know, like in Japan, there's concepts around forest bathing. People go out into the forest and really just center themselves in terms of immersing their senses in the experience of the sounds, the sights, the smells. I'm not sure about like the taste, but we have taste and we have touch. And we think about when we are having an embodied experience, when we're in ourselves, we can work with our senses. Our nervous system is constantly taking in information and processing that in our body. There's been, this is why we have so many apps and so many sounds, and we go, what's the sound of rain? Why is that calming? What's the sound of the ocean and the rhythmic nature of the water? What's the sound of running water in a stream? We think about how sound and nature sounds, birds, all of those kind of things are used and have been used in so many ways to provide a sense of calm or a sense of quiet or a sense of settling. But now there's, there's studies and people are becoming eco-therapists. We're actually training in taking clients and people out into nature to have sessions around trauma recovery and therapy, because they can see and understand that we're working with a much bigger container. When I talk about a container, when we're doing trauma recovery and we're doing safety work, we think about what's the space that you're holding. And that's kind of a concept around going as the therapist or as the person walking alongside that person you're working with. You're kind of physically and emotionally, and I would say you're also energetically holding a space. And that requires you to be as grounded and as centered and as present as possible. So one of the things we know about working with nature and our senses is it requires and calls us, invites us to be present in time and space. And the way that we think about the impact on cortisol levels, so this is why there's been a lot of studies on the benefits of mindfulness, is noticing that actually the cortisol, so that's that stress hormone that I was talking about, that gets raised when there's stress and distress, that comes right down. So when we think about if we're built to respond to danger and our body releases chemicals, and then when this danger's over, we return to safety, it makes sense then to think about what is the role of us connecting to nature to help our whole body come back to a sense of safety. It actually has a chemical impact on us when we allow ourselves to be surrounded by running water, plants, birds, fresh air, sun. I recognise, though, that for many people in the world, that's a privilege, that not everyone has equal access to those spaces. And I've been really aware when I was living in Melbourne, I understood in a way that I've never understood before the role of nature and my nervous system and my well-being during COVID. People may not be aware, but Melbourne experienced the most lockdowns in the world. And one of our lockdowns went for 5.5 months straight. And we were limited to 5 kilometres within our home. So what I really understood there was everything in my world physically became smaller. But what kept me connected and felt like I was part of something much bigger and supported was being able to hear the birds, being able to see the sky, being able to walk by a creek that I live near, which I know is also privilege, but I was so grateful for the invitation I was given to attune to that place. So I've walked past it before and went, yes, that's pretty and that's nice, but this was a whole different level of connection, really just allowing myself to sit and rest and be. And that has now become like a daily practice. I know that if I don't walk out in nature and I'm not by birds or by trees or just looking at the colours, I know my senses and my nervous system is feeling depleted. So it's a real replenishing.
You also deliver workshops and training, trauma-informed workshops and training. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really passionate about and that I do is I've developed a training called Queering Trauma-Informed Practice. And this is in particular for people who, because there's a lot of talk about trauma-informed practice, and then there's a lot of LGBTQIA inclusion training sort of, but there's nothing that thinks about the intersection of the two. There's really nothing that I've come across where people are thinking about how do you work in a trauma-informed way, in particular with LGBTQIA plus people. What might be some of the things you need to think about? And so that training that I offer is online. I can also do some face-to-face, but it's really about thinking around what are the unique experiences. And so I talk about the terms around minority stress, but I talk about what does it actually feel like and experience that in the world. And the kind of the elements of extra oppression that LGBTQI people might experience that continues to perpetuate feelings and experiences of trauma. And then kind of go through and look at what are the ways that you can empower and support and affirm, and really do that with a trauma-informed lens as you work to integrate your practice. So I do that work. I also do responding to and supporting sexual assault survivors, queer sexual assault survivors, and working to understand around responding to victim survivors of intimate partner violence. And also I do work around looking at how to support queer activists and advocates in sustainable practice and sustainable advocacy. So this is another element that I'm really interested in, and I see a great need is that the way that we do advocacy and the way that we work against systemic oppression has kind of often left us very depleted. And there's been a lot of narratives that we might have adopted that say we need to be doing all the things all the times for all the people, or otherwise we're not quite good advocates. And really want to challenge some of the concepts around what does it mean to be working sustainably and to be feeling like we're also filling our lives full of love and joy, and how do we access that? And how does that honour the work of the people who have come before us? So I do those trainings as well. I've been doing a lot of training for a lot of years, so I do have people approach me to say, we would think we need this and we need a bit of that. Can you create something that covers these areas? And I work individually with organisations and people around tailoring particular packages of training. So that can be from a few hours to a couple of days, that sort of thing. And also what I'm looking forward to doing soon is running groups for survivors, queer survivors of sexual assault in particular, and working across experiences of trauma and looking to reclaim experiences of intimacy and pleasure. So that's an area where people are often not supported in, and that's an area I'm going to be moving into to support people in as well.
Question around allyship, and specifically around how we can support people who have gone through intimate partner violence or any sort of violence. How can we be more of an ally to people within the queer community on this topic?
One of the biggest things and one of the biggest barriers that people experience is the fear that they won't be believed. And so the first thing that anybody can do is believe somebody who tells you about their experience, and not to minimize it and not to dismiss it, even if it's something that you don't fully understand, or it's something that perhaps you didn't see. If you might have known that person, or you might have been connected to that couple, to really just take a step back and first of all believe the person who's told you that. It's taken tremendous courage for them to get to that place, and they're trusting you with something that's really, really important. Let them know that you've heard what they've said and that you believe them, and that you're offering a recognition of what's happened. So we talk about that. And then being able to connect someone into support. So you may not know of a service or a place, but you can encourage somebody to access a service if they want to. So it's up to them, it's their choice. Being able to recognise that people need to move at their own pace. They need to be able to go at what pace might suit them. One of the things that's not as helpful is to automatically recommend that people report something to the police. One of the things that needs to be a very individual process, particularly for any victim survivor, but we need to recognise that for queer survivors, the experience and histories involving police, they have not always been safe, and there may be many, many reasons why they don't feel that they would be supported. Having said that, there's also survivors who are supported going to the police. So while as an ally and someone wanting to support someone you care about, you might think that that's a really strong point of trying to support somebody. If you want to raise it, you always say, have you thought about whether you would like to explore reporting this to the police? It's your choice. It's entirely up to you what the right choice is for you. No one can tell you. I would also just continue to offer that support and that friendship, and saying if somebody doesn't want to talk about something now, not to pressure them to tell you all the details. That's really often very unhelpful, and it needs to be about what they need. So you can say, well, you can come and tell me or let me know if you want to talk or you need some support. So keeping that door open. And if you are concerned about somebody's safety, then considering whether you might speak to a service, and you can do that anonymously. So you can ring a service and say, I've got a friend or someone I'm concerned about. I don't want to give any names or details at this stage, but I would like to find out some information about what might be available or how can I link them in. So even if the person you're talking to doesn't feel like they want to take that step, you can find out some information. Really important to respect their privacy and find out some information and continue to give them the choice. Remember that any experience of intimate partner violence or sexual violence is that person's had their choice taken away. So we want to restore their capacity to make choices and let them know that's their right to make choices.
I know as an interviewer and as a cisgender gay man that there are limitations in terms of how I'm even asking these questions. And I might not even know all of the questions to ask. And so is there anything that you would like to share that we haven't covered in this conversation that you feel is important to highlight?
I think one of the things that I would really like people to be aware of and kind of take away is that it's really important to keep connecting to a sense of hope and possibility, and that there is a lot of support that can be accessed. I know sometimes it can feel like a challenge to find it, but there definitely are things to be able to support people, and things can change and they can get better. And there are ways that people can make choices to move towards the safety that they deserve and the life that they deserve. I think that's what I would encourage, that there's a sense of understanding that there's a lot of hope. A lot of times when people talk about trauma and intimate partner violence and sexual violence, it can feel very heavy and can feel like, do things really change? But I really want to encourage people to go, it's absolutely more than possible. And we have incredible capacity in ourselves when we're given support to be able to make amazing transformations and change. And that liberation in terms of sense of self and own experience is absolutely accessible given the support.
What does resilience mean to you?
I think about that, and I think what sits more with me is what I've sort of talked about in that my own experience of learning, which continues, is around how we have extraordinary capacity to alchemize and transform ourselves through the experiences that we've had. And it's that ability to sit in that place of transformation and to take that as an incredible power that we have, and to be able to use that intentionally. So if something comes along in life that is unexpected and it's a challenge, and we all face that in many different ways, being able to be grounded in yourself to go, how am I going to transform this so that I come out into a place that feels even bigger and better than before? And so it's kind of that moving through and understanding that transformation can be really, hard work and messy and feel very uncertain and not clear, but that it is a process of incredible power and possibility. And that's a massively creative and expansive experience. And I think that that's part of what is exciting to know about who we are as humans and who we are when we connect to a greater world around us.
How can people reach you if they want to contact you?
So they can contact me on my website, which is belindabannerman.com, and you can just email me there. And I'm very happy to chat to people, talk to people, share information.
Thank you so much, Belinda. I really appreciate you opening up and talking about a very difficult, challenging, but important topic. And thank you for sharing all of your insights and wisdom.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.